The date was May 10, 1940. The sky over southwestern Germany hung heavy with clouds as the morning light struggled to break through the gray canopy. In the medieval university town of Freiburg in Breisgau, nestled near the French border in the Black Forest region, citizens went about their daily routines with little concern. The war that had begun 8 months earlier seemed distant, a problem for other cities, other nations. Freiburg, with its Gothic cathedral spire reaching toward the heavens and its cobblestone streets winding through centuries-old neighborhoods, appeared far removed from the violence consuming Europe. But at precisely 3:59 in the afternoon, the tranquil spring day shattered into chaos. Without warning, the screaming descent of falling bombs tore through the air. Explosions erupted across the city center. The railway station convulsed under direct hits. Buildings collapsed into rubble. Most horrifically, 2 bombs fell upon a children's playground near the Hilda Tower, where young voices that had been raised in laughter moments before were silenced forever. When the smoke cleared and the desperate search through debris began, the toll became grimly apparent. 57 civilians lay dead, including 22 children. The city's anti-aircraft defenses had never fired a single shot. The air raid sirens had never sounded. The attack had come and gone before anyone could react. The reason for this catastrophic failure of defense was as shocking as it was tragic. The aircraft that had delivered death from above were not enemy planes at all. They were German. 3 Heinkel He-111 medium bombers from Kampfgeschwader 51, one of the Luftwaffe's own squadrons, had just committed the ultimate military blunder. Nazi Germany had bombed itself. In the fog of war, amid the confusion of navigational errors and overcast skies, German pilots had mistaken their own city for an enemy target and unleashed their deadly cargo upon their own people. The irony was devastating. The consequences would prove far-reaching. What followed was not an acknowledgement of error, but rather one of the most cynical propaganda operations of the entire Second World War. Within hours, the Nazi regime would transform this tragedy into a weapon, twist the truth into lies, and use the blood of German children to justify the horrors that would follow. This is the story of the Freiburg bombing, a tale of human error, political manipulation, and the dark machinery of totalitarian propaganda. It is a story that reveals how easily truth becomes the first casualty of war, and how the deaths of innocents can be exploited by those who claim to protect them. The tragedy that unfolded in Freiburg on that spring afternoon would have consequences that neither the pilots nor their victims could have imagined, setting in motion a chain of events that would help shape the brutal air war over Europe. To understand how German bombers came to attack their own territory, we must first understand the context of that fateful day in May 1940. Europe stood at a critical juncture. The period known as the Phony War, those months of relative quiet following the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, had come to an abrupt end. On the very morning of May 10, Adolf Hitler had unleashed Fall Gelb, the German offensive against France and the Low Countries. It was the beginning of what would become one of the most stunning military campaigns in modern history. The Luftwaffe played a central role in German war plans. Under the command of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the German Air Force had already demonstrated its capabilities in Poland, where coordinated air strikes had paralyzed enemy defenses and spread terror among civilian populations. Now, as German forces prepared to sweep through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg on their way to France, the Luftwaffe was tasked with striking deep into enemy territory. Airfields, railway junctions, communication centers, and military installations throughout France were designated as priority targets. The goal was to achieve rapid air superiority and disrupt Allied responses to the ground offensive. Lieutenant Paul Seidel commanded one such mission. He and his crew, flying as part of a 3-aircraft formation from the 8th Staffel of Kampfgeschwader 51, received orders to bomb the French city of Dijon, or alternatively, the Dolgera airport. These were legitimate military targets, located deep in eastern France. The mission was straightforward in theory. Take off from Landsberg-Lech Air Base in Bavaria at 2:27 in the afternoon, fly southwest over German territory, cross the Rhine River into France, locate the target, deliver the payload, and return home. The crews had trained for such operations. They knew their aircraft, the reliable Heinkel He-111 medium bomber, intimately. They understood the importance of their mission on this first day of the Western offensive. What they could not control was the weather. As the three aircraft flew westward, they encountered increasingly dense cloud cover. Navigation in 1940 relied heavily on visual landmarks. Pilots needed to see the ground, to identify rivers, towns, road networks, and other features that would confirm their position and guide them to their targets. But the clouds that day were thick and persistent. The crew became disoriented. They lost their bearings. Unable to determine their exact position with certainty, they made a fateful assumption. They convinced themselves they had crossed the Rhine. They believed they were over French territory. When they spotted a church spire rising through the fog, they identified it as belonging to St. Martin's Church in Colmar, a French city just 35 kilometers from Freiburg on the opposite side of the border. It was a catastrophic misidentification. The church they saw was in Freiburg itself, not Colmar. They had not crossed the Rhine at all. They were still over Germany, over a city filled with their own civilians, their own families, their own future. At 3:59 p.m., convinced they were attacking an enemy target, Lieutenant Seidel's formation began their bombing run. 69 bombs fell from the bellies of the three aircraft. Some struck the railway station. Others fell on residential neighborhoods. 2 landed directly on a playground where children had been at play. The bombers turned for home, their crews believing they had successfully completed their mission against the enemy. They had no idea of the horror they had just unleashed upon their own people. The immediate aftermath of the bombing was chaos and confusion. Emergency services rushed to the scene, confronting a nightmare of collapsed buildings, fires, and casualties. Rescuers pulled broken bodies from the rubble. Parents searched frantically for their children. Medical personnel worked desperately to save the wounded. The death toll climbed steadily as more victims were discovered. 22 children were among the dead, 13 women, 11 male civilians, and 11 military personnel. The wounded numbered in the hundreds. For the citizens of Freiburg, the attack made no sense. The city held little strategic value. It was not a major industrial center. It did not house significant military installations. It was a university town, known for its culture, its historic architecture, its academic traditions. Why would the Allies target such a place? Yet the evidence seemed clear. Enemy aircraft had bombed them. Who else could be responsible? The local anti-aircraft defenses had observed the aircraft during the attack. They had identified them as German planes. This observation created immediate confusion. German aircraft flying over German territory was not unusual. The defenders had assumed the planes were en route to targets in France. They never imagined the bombers would attack their own city. Even when the bombs began to fall, the defenders hesitated, uncertain whether to engage what appeared to be friendly aircraft. By the time the full reality became clear, the attack was over. The air raid sirens wailed only after the bombers had departed, a futile warning for an attack already completed. The police president of Freiburg, a thorough and methodical man, began collecting physical evidence from the bomb sites. He gathered fragments of the exploded ordnance, carefully cataloging each piece. His examination revealed serial numbers stamped into the metal casings. These numbers told an undeniable story. The bombs were German-made. He traced them from the munitions factory where they were produced to the Luftwaffe armory at Lechfeld, near Munich. The evidence was conclusive. German bombs had fallen on Freiburg. German aircraft had delivered them. This was not an Allied attack. It was friendly fire, a tragic accident born of navigational error and poor weather conditions. But the truth would not be allowed to emerge. The Nazi regime moved swiftly to control the narrative. The incident was immediately classified. Local officials were ordered to suppress the evidence. The police president's findings were buried. Instead, the propaganda machinery of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda began to spin an entirely different story. Within hours of the attack, official news agencies were reporting that the Western Allies had conducted a brutal and cowardly assault on an undefended German city. The bombing was described as a clear violation of international law, a war crime, an atrocity committed against innocent civilians by the barbaric forces of France and Britain. The German newspaper, Freiburger Zeitung, published inflammatory accounts on May 11th. The attack was characterized as malicious, sneaky, and cowardly, carried out in complete disregard for the laws of humanity. The official death toll was initially reported as 24 civilians, though this number would rise to 57 as more bodies were recovered. The Nazi propaganda machine seized upon the deaths of the children with particular fervor. Heart-wrenching photographs of the destroyed playground were distributed to newspapers across Germany and to friendly and neutral nations worldwide. Film crews documented the funerals held 4 days after the attack, capturing images of grieving families, small coffins, and devastated community members. This footage was screened throughout Germany and distributed internationally, generating widespread condemnation of what was portrayed as Allied barbarism. The propaganda operation included explicit threats of retaliation. Official statements warned that any further attacks on German civilians would be met with five-fold retaliation against French and British cities. The message was clear. The Allies had started the terror bombing of civilian populations. Germany would respond with overwhelming force. The lie was complete. The tragedy of Freiburg had been transformed into a justification for the horrors to come. While the Nazi propaganda machine worked overtime to exploit the Freiburg tragedy, the men responsible for the bombing struggled with their own confusion. The 3 crews from Kampfgeschwader 51 returned to their base believing they had successfully attacked the secondary target, Doljura Airport in France. They filed reports consistent with this belief. Only later, when questions began to arise about the mission, did they realize something had gone terribly wrong. The official Luftwaffe position became one of careful evasion. The crews eventually claimed they had attacked Old-Tavo, maintaining the fiction that they had struck an enemy target. Colonel Joseph Kamhuber, the commander of Kampfgeschwader 51 at the time, would spend decades deflecting questions about the incident. For years, he maintained that it would never be possible to clarify definitively who was responsible for the bombing of Freiburg. It was a masterful example of bureaucratic obfuscation, designed to protect both his unit's reputation and the larger Nazi narrative. But truth has a way of persisting, even when buried under layers of propaganda and official denial. The weight of evidence could not be suppressed forever. German historians, working decades after the war, began to piece together what had actually happened on May 10, 1940. Anton Hock, Wolfram Wett, and Gerdar Uberschar conducted exhaustive research into the Freiburg bombing. They examined Luftwaffe records, interviewed surviving participants, analyzed the physical evidence that had been collected but never publicly acknowledged, and traced the chain of command and mission orders. Their findings were conclusive and damning. In August 1980, a full 40 years after the tragedy, Colonel Kamhuber finally admitted the truth to military historians. His statement was unequivocal. The attack on Freiburg was conducted mistakenly by aircraft from 3/KG-51. It was evident. It was undeniable. The navigational error, the misidentification of landmarks, the assumption that the Rhine had been crossed when it had not, all of these factors had combined to produce a catastrophic friendly fire incident. The Luftwaffe had bombed one of its own cities. The Nazi regime had known this almost immediately. And they had chosen to lie about it. The propaganda value of the Freiburg bombing proved too valuable to abandon, even as the truth became increasingly difficult to conceal. Adolf Hitler himself referenced the incident in a speech to workers at the Borsig factory in Berlin on December 10, 1940. He accused British Prime Minister Winston Churchill of having initiated terror attacks against German civilians, specifically citing the bombing of Freiburg as the first such atrocity. The falsehood was repeated at the highest levels of the Nazi state, embedded in the official history of the war, and used to justify the Luftwaffe's subsequent campaigns against British cities. The myth persisted long after the war ended. Many Germans continued to believe that Allied aircraft had bombed Freiburg in May 1940. The power of the original propaganda, combined with a post-war reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths, allowed the lie to survive for decades. Only through the persistent efforts of historians committed to documenting the full reality of the war did the truth finally emerge. 45 years after the disaster, in 1985, the city of Freiburg erected a memorial near the Hilda playground, where 20 children had been killed. The inscription on the memorial stone acknowledged the historical truth. Nazi propaganda had presented the incident as a terrorist attack by enemy planes to justify retaliations by the German Air Force. But the victims had died at the hands of their own military. It was a final, bitter acknowledgement of the tragedy and the lies that followed. The bombing of Freiburg represents more than a simple navigational error or an unfortunate accident of war. It stands as a stark example of how totalitarian regimes manipulate truth, exploit tragedy, and use the suffering of their own people to advance political and military objectives. The 57 civilians who died on May 10, 1940, were victims twice over. First, they died under German bombs delivered by German pilots in a catastrophic mistake. Second, their deaths were appropriated by the Nazi regime, their memories distorted, and their sacrifice used to justify further violence against others. The immediate strategic consequences of the Freiburg incident were significant. The Nazi propaganda narrative established a framework for escalating the air war. By claiming that the Allies had initiated terror bombing against German civilians, the regime created justification for similar tactics by the Luftwaffe. This narrative would be invoked repeatedly in the months and years that followed. When German bombers attacked Rotterdam in May 1940, killing hundreds of Dutch civilians, the regime could point to Freiburg. When the Blitz began against London in September 1940, killing thousands of British civilians, the regime could claim retaliation for Allied crimes. When German cities were later devastated by Allied strategic bombing campaigns, the regime could cast Germany as the victim, conveniently forgetting that the entire chain of escalation had been built on a foundation of lies. The broader implications for civilian populations were catastrophic. The barriers against targeting non-combatants, already weakened by the experiences of the First World War and the Spanish Civil War, collapsed entirely during the Second World War. All sides engaged in strategic bombing campaigns that deliberately targeted urban population centers. The firebombing of Hamburg, the destruction of Dresden, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all of these horrors emerged from a logic of total war that treated civilian morale as a legitimate military target. While it would be historically inaccurate to attribute this entire development to the Freiburg incident alone, the propaganda surrounding it contributed to the psychological and political climate that made such campaigns possible. For the city of Freiburg itself, the May 10th bombing proved to be only a preview of worse devastation to come. The city remained largely untouched by Allied bombing throughout most of the war, spared because it was not considered a priority target. This created a false sense of security among residents. But as Allied forces advanced through France in late 1944, Freiburg's position on the Rhine Valley Rail line made it strategically important. On November 27, 1944, the British Royal Air Force launched Operation Tigerfish, a massive bombing raid on the city. Over 300 Lancaster bombers dropped more than 1,700 tons of high explosives and incendiaries. The attack killed over 2,000 people, wounded nearly 10,000 more, and destroyed much of the historic Old Town. The Gothic cathedral survived, its medieval stone construction proving remarkably resilient, but the surrounding neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The stories of those who lived through both attacks revealed the human cost of aerial warfare. Survivors of the 1940 friendly fire incident had believed the official narrative. They thought enemy aircraft had killed their neighbors. When the devastating 1944 raid occurred, they saw it as revenge, as part of an escalating cycle of violence. Few realized that the first attack had been German, that their own government had lied to them, that the supposed Allied atrocity used to justify so much subsequent violence had never occurred. The truth was buried under propaganda, suppressed by censorship, and obscured by the fog of war. This story serves as a reminder of the importance of truth, even uncomfortable truth, especially uncomfortable truth, in understanding history. The bombing of Freiburg on May 10, 1940, was a tragedy born of human error. What made it a scandal was the calculated decision to exploit that tragedy for propaganda purposes. The Nazi regime chose deception over honesty, political advantage over moral responsibility, and in doing so, set a precedent for the manipulation of civilian suffering that would characterize the entire war. Today, the memorial stone near the Hilda playground stands as a quiet testament to those who died and to the power of historical truth. The inscription reminds visitors that propaganda once transformed these victims into tools of war. But it also affirms that truth eventually prevails, that honest historical accounting matters, and that we have a responsibility to remember not just what people died for, but how their deaths were exploited by those who claimed to honor them. The children who died playing on that spring afternoon in 1940 deserve better than to become pawns in a propaganda war. They deserve the truth. And now, more than 8 decades later, we finally have it.